All right, welcome to class. This is American Federal Government. My name is Ken Hicks. As we're shooting this, one of the big events, an inflection point in the 2024 presidential elections is going to occur tonight. You're going to see the second presidential debate, the first presidential debate, including new Democratic nominee Kamala Harris. Debates are interesting political phenomena. The question of how important they can be, I think, is something that's often discussed. I think certainly the first presidential debate that occurred in June between then presumptive Democratic nominee and presidential incumbent Joe Biden and the Republican challenger Donald Trump, who was a former president, was immensely consequential for the simple fact that it really demonstrated the infirmities that Joe Biden was going through. The man's 82 years old, and his staff had spent a lot of time just kind of keeping him out of the spotlight, minimizing the extent to which cameras were on him when he was walking, and it just he shuffled out onto the stage. He gave very, very faltering answers. The response later on was that he was not well that night, but it galvanized Democrats and really compelled a movement to cause Biden to withdraw from the race, and that had an important effect on the Democratic electorate with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. A lot of what pollsters had been describing as the double haters, the people who were not going to vote for Donald Trump, but who really didn't think that Joe Biden should be running for re-election at his advanced age. A lot of those people started to come home to Kamala Harris. And right now, with just a few weeks between now and the next presidential election, you effectively have a dead heat where both parties can look at their presidential candidates and say that they have a real shot, which plays into the media's narrative. They really love reporting campaigns from what we call a horse race perspective. They like being like the announcers, saying who's behind, who's gaining ground, who's losing ground, because then you get all the excitement that draws attention to the event, which is good for the media, because I always want to say this: the media is privately owned, corporately managed, publicly traded, and run for a profit. They want to make money. And exciting presidential campaigns are moneymakers for the media. And so their incentives in reporting on this race are to accentuate the competitiveness of the race. And so right now they have the kind of presidential race that they want to see. Now, what's going to happen tonight? It's hard to say. I think it's clear that the rules that operated under the previous debate are going to be in effect, which basically means that once a candidate gives an answer, their mics are going to be cut subsequently, so that when the other candidate is speaking, the candidates won't be able to break in on one another. That was actually a rule negotiated by the Biden campaign because they believed that would help their candidate in managing the challenges of dealing with a candidate, dealing with an opponent like Donald Trump, who is his strategy for debating is to try and dominate his opponent, to say controversial things, to make his opponent spend a lot of time trying to rebut the things that he has said. And he's a very unorthodox debater, which makes it very hard to really get a handle on him. So In terms of previewing it, I think one thing that you can say is that Kamala Harris has a reputation of being a very effective debater. She has very long governmental experience in public service, and a big part of that public service was as a prosecutor. She served as a line prosecutor in California in the San Francisco district. She was California's Attorney General, so she has, spent a lot of time, prosecuting cases, and that is important, I think, and it's a skill that transfers pretty readily onto the debate stage. Now, the broader question as a political scientist is, what is the utility of presidential debates? And the first thing I would say is they're not really debates. They do not follow the traditional format where both sides get the same question. They have to take pro and con on the sides. There are formal rules governing debates. Debates are judged, very, very closely. Presidential debates are much more akin to what I call hostile joint press conferences. They get questions, and then they give, they spend a great deal of time prepping, to give kind of stock, very well rehearsed responses to those questions. Because one thing we have learned is that the debates are rarely dispositive unless somebody makes a really big mistake. And so, typically candidates for both parties spend a great deal of time trying to scourge any kind of loose talk out of their debate prep. Now, that's a real difficulty for Republicans because, frankly, Donald Trump is very undisciplined. He's very impulsive. He likes to just go with the flow. He likes to follow his gut. And so that makes it very difficult for people to get him to stay on task. To date, he really hasn't suffered from that lack of discipline on the debate stage. When he debated Hillary Clinton, a lot of people felt like his kind of looming over her in a menacing fashion while she was, in the background, while walking, stalking behind her, actually had an effect on the audience a little bit. They felt like, again, he was dominating. During the 2020 debates, a lot of people felt like the fact that he actually contracted COVID. He had COVID during the first presidential debate, and subsequently really kind of started acting a little bit unhinged in the second debate. That really cost him in the 2020 elections. That again, he was more disciplined in 2016, and far less disciplined in 2020. And the question is, will he be able to master his urges to just lash out at Kamala Harris? So there it is. That's what we're going to be looking at, over the course of today. Our subject for today's class is state and local government. And so last week we were looking at federalism. And federalism, again, refers to this idea of compound sovereignty, where you divide sovereignty between a national government and lower, semi-sovereign state governments. And so I also like to describe it as a system of negotiated sovereignty. And so last week we looked at federalism from sort of a bottom-down perspective. How does the federal government perceive the intergovernmental relationships, which is this relationship between the federal, state, and local governments? So today we're going to, today and next class we're going to be looking at federalism from a bottom-up perspective. So what are we learning today? First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of state and local governments in American politics. They play a very important role. They have, local governments have carved out an important role. And then the Constitution also guarantees to each state a Republican form of government. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that idea of a Republican form of government means. So very frequently you find state and local governments at odds with one another. And part of the reason for that is that state and local governments have contrasting economic interests. When you think about it, for example, if you were going to talk about it, local government wanted to impose a fracking ban. Well, in Oklahoma and in South Dakota and Louisiana and several other states, Alaska, basically the dominant economic interests at the state level is the energy sector. They provide an enormous number of jobs, and they don't want a business environment where energy companies feel like they are being constricted in how they're doing their business. So it's not uncommon for state governments to say to local governments, no, you can't impose a fracking ban. And the reality is, because of the lack of constitutional status of local governments, they really have no constitutional protections. And so the result is, and again, there are good reasons for states to not necessarily want a patchwork of regulatory issues going back and forth at the local and then to the state level. And so, for example, in the early, like around 2014, 2015, Stillwater tried to impose a fracking ban within the city limits. Now, why was Stillwater doing that? Well, because fracking is enormously disruptive activity, and homeowners don't like, frackers, going into the field behind their homes and doing hydraulic fracturing. It's a highly pollutive activity that can, damage the value of homes. Not to mention that if they're a little bit reckless, one of the things that happens with fracking is you generate a great deal of wastewater, because that's part of what you're doing is you're injecting water with chemicals down in deep into the crust to basically blast loose oil and natural gas. And when you do that, again, you get a byproduct of water that is basically, you can't recover it. So what they do is inject it into deep water wells. Well, if they, and people pay, well operators to inject all that water deep down into the crust. Well, if you inject too much water into the crust, what do you get? You get earthquakes, and that's another thing that causes homeowners to be troubled, because you end up having to pier your house if your foundation cracks. It can destroy homes. So, very often what you're looking at with these kinds of conflicts are conflicts between state level economic interests and homeowners at the local level. Because at the local level, homeowners are important constituencies that local governments don't want to antagonize. One of the important things, and one of the things that distinguishes American federalism from many other countries and how they practice federalism, are the differences within and across states. So American states display incredible diversity in population, geographic size, access to natural resources, and economic productivity. For example, the largest state, California, has a population of 38.9 million people, while Wyoming has a population of just over 582,000. Alaska is the largest state in terms of acreage, spans over 665,000 square miles, while the nation's smallest state, Rhode Island, is barely 1,500 square miles. California's economist by itself is the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world, produces over $3 trillion in gross domestic product, while Vermont's the smallest economy of the states produces just over $31 billion. Those are 2022 figures. So again, as we learned from our discussion last week of federalism, the differences in governance between states also create significant differences as well. For example, you have two towns in Idaho and Washington that are divided by the Snake River. Lewiston, Idaho, and Clarkston, Washington. That forms the boundary between Idaho and Washington state. Culturally, the citizens of eastern Washington and Idaho are pretty much indistinguishable. They're rural parts of their respective states. They generally share this kind of mind your own business libertarianism and religious conservatism that is oftentimes characteristic of rural communities in the Mountain West. But Clarkston is governed by the state of Washington. and its state government is controlled by the heavily populated cities along Washington's coast. As a result, the city of Clarkston has access to medicinal and recreational marijuana. Its terminally ill citizens have a right to a physician-assisted suicide as part of their end-of-life planning. Meanwhile, in Idaho, it's a right-to-work state. Its workers can refuse to join a union, and workers in Clarkston, in contrast, again, have to pay fair share fees for collective bargaining. So even down to the county level, when you think about Virginia and West Virginia, Loudoun County, Virginia, and Jefferson County, West Virginia, share a 14-mile border separated by, again, a watershed of runoff from the Blue Ridge Mountains. Loudoun County has benefited from its proximity to the suburbs of Washington, D.C., with business startups increasing by 50% between 2005 and 2015. In contrast, Jefferson County has effectively stagnated economically. Loudoun and Jefferson counties have also changed dramatically in their voting behavior. Loudoun County voted for George W. Bush, a Republican, in 2004, but today is a solidly blue county, while Jefferson County has gone deep red and has only supported Republicans. So even within states, you oftentimes will have competition over existing resources that frequently fuels increasingly bitter partisan fights at both the state and the local levels. For example, there's a small town in northern Minnesota called Ely, and its inhabitants have been sharply divided over public land use. On the one hand, longtime residents of Ely want to continue the mining operations that was the historic lifeblood of the town. It's the reason the town was created. On the other hand, incoming environmentalists want to preserve the natural beauty of the Boundary Waters region, that's part of the surrounding Ely area, and they want to advocate ecotourism as a more sustainable livelihood for the citizens of Ely. These are mutually exclusive visions of how Ely should exist going forward, and that fuels really bitter resentment that spills over into state politics, as elections at the state level often determine which group's interests will prevail. And when you think about it right now, the Democratic Party's vice presidential nominee is his name is Tim Walz, and he's from a rural part of Minnesota, but he's been a very liberal Democrat as governor, and that has really antagonized a lot of rural people in Minnesota, but also rural people elsewhere. And so a lot of people were thinking with the nomination of Tim Walz that Democrats would be able to reach out to these rural voters who have increasingly fled from the Democratic Party. But the reality is, just because Tim Walz was from Nebraska and lived and was elected out of a rural district in Minnesota to the House of Representatives for several terms, those folks still don't like him because of what he represents. It doesn't matter where you're from when the culture wars are burning this hot. So state and local governments are very important actors, and it's important to keep in mind the impact that the New Deal had on the relationship between federal and state governments. So you have a period, certainly from the time that the Constitution was ratified until well into the 20th century. State and local governments did most of the governing. Most of the actual governing. And in fact, over the course of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, state governments remained dominant, and they were the ones that spent most of the money in government. You still had the federal government. There was no income tax until 1913, and they really didn't use the income tax very aggressively until the Great Depression. But the Great Depression fundamentally challenged the role of state governments and led to an expanded federal role. So when we think about it, federalism worked well, and state governments were the dominant governing entity until you have industrialization, which massively expands economic productivity in the United States and begins to create interstate relationships that begin to challenge the capacity of state governments to effectively regulate. And again, one of the problems is that state governments are relatively easily corruptible, okay? Especially in low population states where you have the dominant economic interest is a mono activity. Like in Montana, for much of its history, the dominant economic activity was mining. Same in Utah and several other mountain states. Well, when the mining, when the owners of mines basically run the state's economy, it's not hard for them to also dominate the state's government. It's not hard for them to put their hand on the shoulder of preferred candidates and for people who work in the mines to say, okay, we're going to vote for that guy. The Great Depression fundamentally changed the relationship between the federal government and the economy, and between the federal government and the states, and between citizens and the federal government, okay? It's important to keep in mind how kind of federalism first and foremost uses the regulatory power, the fact that Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce, to dramatically expand the role of the federal government in managing the economy. So you begin to see the use of grants from the federal government. Remember the power of the income tax. With that additional money, they begin to send money back to the states to again influence the behavior of state governments. And so they were attempting to, during the New Deal period, this period that we call cooperative federalism, they were trying to use the power of the federal government, the spending power, to mainly jumpstart economies in the struggling states. And it's important to keep in mind, again, remember, unemployment was running at nearly 25% in most states, and that doesn't even count women. Women were not part of the workforce at that time. And so people were literally facing starvation. There were hundreds of thousands of men running, taking rides on railroads on the rumor that there were jobs to be had in some neighboring county or in some neighboring state. They were just running around the country just pursuing jobs. And so the New Deal was primarily just trying to get people back to work. As one economist, John Maynard Keynes, said, it's more important just to pay people to dig holes and then pay other people to fill the holes in, because then that gets money in people's hands that they can use to buy needed products, food and clothing and things like that. So one of the dramatic things that emerged out of the New Deal, the second phase of the New Deal, was called the Hill-Burton Act. And the Hill-Burton Act is actually a response to something that happened more than a quarter of a century earlier. In 1919 and in 1920, you had a global pandemic. It was called the Spanish influenza pandemic. It killed 60 million people worldwide and killed over, I believe, 600,000 Americans, which was, and again, much smaller population at that point, probably less than around 100 million people in 1920. And so from that period forward, from 1920 until 1946, the one thing we began, policymakers began recognizing was that our population was large enough now that public health needed to be a much bigger concern. Up to that point, most public health measures took place at the local level, at the county and the municipal level. Increasingly, you begin to see more and more money being invested in creating hospital systems. And the Hill-Burton Act of 1946 is the first real step towards building a public health care infrastructure in the United States. Up till that point, most hospitals were built sort of with a combination of private and public dollars. The Hill-Burton Act, provides significant amounts of money to state and local governments to build hospitals. And so, again, the point was, that pandemic created an environment where they were literally having to find empty buildings where they could warehouse people who were falling ill. And then they literally could not manage all the people that were dying as a result of that influenza, because they never developed a vaccine for Spanish influenza in that period of time. Okay, so again, that reflects a growing partnership between the federal, state, and local governments. And again, this idea of cooperative federalism is this notion that we can be collaborative in pursuing these consensus deals. We decide on a consensus at the national level, and then we make the state and local governments a deal that they can't refuse, right? We're going to throw money at them and say, just build hospitals, just build schools, right? I went to a high school that was built during the Great Depression. It was, the first stones were laid in the 1930s, okay? So one of the things that begins happening over the course of the 20th century is that increasingly, from the New Deal until the 1960s, America is confronting increasingly intractable political problems that began to raise questions about the viability of the American states. And again, the New Deal, the Great Society, I would add the Cold War to that, to this list, and then of course the civil rights movements and the environmental movements. All of these are kind of national problems, and national solutions are being proposed at the federal level. And one of the reasons for that is that well into the 20th century, state governments remain, I'm going to characterize it as parochialized, okay? The interests governing the state tend to be very insular. They tend to be economic in nature. Again, you've got the dominant, economy. Here in Oklahoma, it was ag and energy, okay? In Louisiana, it was also kind of a similar combination of agricultural and energy interests, which are two of the more conservative political interests that you're going to find. In New York and Illinois, you had big cities that are manufacturing hubs and distribution hubs, and also are becoming hugely populated, and the cities are becoming dominated by public sector workers, by teachers, by law enforcement, by firefighters, by civil administrators. These are people whose interests are the interests effectively of government, okay? And so one of the things that's happening is that in some states, especially when you get to the latter 19th century, you begin to see the effect of the progressive era. And the progressive era was a good government reform era that emerged as a result of corruption, at the state and local level. You had a lot of, political machines that dominated large municipal governments. You had statewide machines that controlled entire states like Virginia and Georgia and again Louisiana. And so corruption is becoming such a big problem, and it's impeding effective government to the extent that reformers, again, and this is a kind of a national movement that's coalescing alongside of another movement called the populist movement, that is attempting to improve government and basically make government more responsive to the will of the people, okay? So you begin to see, and again, what's happening at the state level that's improving professionalization and competence? One thing is that they're beginning to adopt, legislative codes of ethics. They're beginning to increase the staffing of both the governor's, branch and the state legislative branches. State legislatures are improving their competence by raising, pay. By making the job of a state legislator something that is more of a career path than simply being an amateur hobby, and they're trying to improve the quality of governance. And again, one of the things that's happening also, and it's always important to keep in mind that governments without the revenue capacity really lack governing capacity. And so one of the things that many state governments also do is they adopt their own state income taxes, following the federal government's adoption of a national income tax resulting from the ratification of the 16th Amendment. So the result of that is a series of reforms that leads to, by the 1980s, a resurgence of state governments. Okay, and again, this is a byproduct of the reforms of the 1960s that included, again, merit-based civil service reforms that improved the professionalization of state bureaucracies, more professionalized legislatures with more staff, and specialized research and legislative specialists. But again, events that altered the relationship between the federal government, again, include coronavirus, again, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, the CARES Act, which again was an enormous outflow of money from the federal government to the state government. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021, a lot of the road building that's happening here in Oklahoma. Remember, how long did we go around with just bad roads? It was very sporadic where roads were being fixed, and then only when people were afraid that a bridge was going to collapse or something like that. Now there's shovels in the ground, and largely, again, because the federal government is providing aid to all those states that had shovel-ready projects ready to go. Another thing that has affected the relationship between the federal and the state governments is the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. So again, state governments largely emerged and began to be more relevant in part because Republicans wanted more government at the state level. They began advocating and arguing, and I think I mentioned this in my previous discussion of federalism, that scholarship began to emerge saying that the national government is too strong, that we are federalist in name only, and that more power needed to be redistributed to the states. And Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980 on the promise that he would attempt to move more power and responsibility back to the state governments. He basically made the argument that government is not the problem, government is not the solution, government is the problem. And he began saying basically again that more problems need to be resolved at the state level rather than at the federal level. Now again, part of the reason for this is that that the Republican Party is the party of larger economic interests, manufacturing and big banking and things like that. And they want more government at the state level because the state governments are more amenable to the kinds of policies that the big money people want to have going. It gets back to what happened, why state governments became so corrupted in the early part of the 20th century, because there was more and more money sloshing around and basically influencing the direction of the state governments. And so this is basically a reaction against the effectiveness of the national government, especially in two areas: in civil rights and in environmental regulatory policy. A lot of people, in the federalism scholarship basically say 1965 was the year that everything changed. And what changed? Well, you got the Voting Rights Act, which basically made it illegal to suppress the votes of black Americans and other minority groups, and also a raft of regulatory policies, including the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and other environmental legislation that effectively began the process of the federal government saying to industry, you have to clean up your act, you're polluting too much. And it was basically the consequence of roughly 90 years of unregulated industrialization, right? Industrial activity was polluting waterways, was polluting the airwaves. Many parts of the United States, like the Midwest, were suffering from acid rain, where the rainwater was so acidified that it was scorching the ground. It could burn you. when you were in a rainstorm. And so, rivers were catching fire. These are all things that produce the regulatory activity of the federal government. And by the 1980s, you're seeing a reaction to that. This is one thing you see that's a kind of enduring theme of American government. Government does something that harms the interests of very powerful people, and those powerful people get mobilized to react against that, okay? And so, this is sort of the natural ebb and flow of American politics. So our second issue is that the Constitution guarantees to each state a republican form of government. So despite the differences among states, the Constitution is designed to ensure that all state governments include certain republican institutions. And what do I mean by republicanism? It means a kind of system of limited government, right, where powers are shared and where there are shared and separated powers. And so the whole idea behind republicanism is to constrain the power of government to prevent tyrannical coercion being imposed on citizens. So what are some of those guarantees? Article 4, Section 4, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature can't be convened against domestic violence. Okay. Other Republican guarantees include this idea of federalism, which kind of flows throughout. Every mention of the state governments in the Constitution is a reflection of federalism. Also, the Second and 10th Amendments are reflections of this commitment to federalism. One of the things that a lot of people were worried about, especially in the southern states, was that the Congress in Article 1 gave to, or the Constitution in Article 1 gave to the Congress the power to raise and support armies. And they feared that that would effectively bar the states from raising and training their own militias. And that was the purpose, that was the original intent behind the Second Amendment. It's also important to keep in mind that that subsequently also protected the right of southern states to raise and operate what were known as slave patrols, which were paramilitary armed patrols that would roam through the countryside looking for escaped slaves. Okay. Two very important, Ann Bowman and Rick Kearney. Both of them were faculty members at the University of South Carolina when I attended the University of South Carolina. I actually painted Rick Kearney's house when I was a grad student. I don't know if he was very happy with the job or not, but he did pay me. They make this comment: all state constitutions both distribute and constrain power. They set forth the basic framework and operating rules for government, allocate power to the three branches, establish the scope of state and local government's authority, protect individual rights, and address various public policies. Only the federal government and state statutes take priority over state constitutions. And there's a lot of important differences between federal and state constitutions. For one thing, state constitutions typically pay a great deal more attention to public policy. Frequently, states will use the initiative process to add policy preferences to the state constitution, which leads to a patchwork of different policies being enshrined in states' constitutions, making it extremely difficult to overturn. Examples can include the Ohio Constitution's mandating a bonus for Korean War veterans, or the Oklahoma Constitution establishing a flash test for kerosene oil and the maximum level of interest a bank can charge for a loan. Another example is Utah's constitution prohibiting children under the age of 14 from working in underground mines. In each of these instances, what you're looking at are again, dominant economic interests either being constrained or otherwise redirected. For example, here in Oklahoma, it was really a case of, it was a point of real frustration that many people were sold adulterated kerosene, which most homes, most cooking took place on kerosene. Based on kerosene fuel. And if it didn't burn very well, of course, you couldn't cook very well. And so it was obviously so important to the people of Oklahoma that they encouraged that in their constitution. They wrote it into the rule book. Another important thing is that you have the constitutions at the state level tend to be a lot longer. And part of the reason for that is that they oftentimes include processes for incorporating municipalities and basically managing state and local intergovernmental relations. And so that's part of the reason why state constitutions tend to be quite a bit longer. And Oklahoma has the somewhat dubious distinction of having the longest constitution. Oklahoma's constitution is a product of its time. The Enabling Act allowed the unification of Oklahoma and Indian territories into one state. The Constitutional Convention that met in Guthrie reflected the prevailing political attitudes. Keep in mind, this was a state primarily comprised of Native Americans and relatively recent people who came to this state. Looking for land. It was primarily an agrarian, state, people that were growing crops. This was, also around the time that you're beginning to find that oil is more and more important, and the discovery of huge oil deposits, made Oklahoma kind of the place to be. That attracted a lot of kind of sketchy people during that period of time, and there was a pretty strong anti-government, especially anti-federal government attitude among the people of Oklahoma in this early, the period of the early opening decades of the 20th century. Largely because, the territory was being governed by Republicans, because Republicans had predominantly controlled the federal government in this period. And the federal government also was responsible for regulating the railroads, and the railroads were a major source of antagonism for a majority of the people of Oklahoma and elsewhere. A lot of Midwestern and Southwestern people were deeply hostile to the railroads because they held an effective monopoly on the movement of the goods that they were growing to get to marketplaces. So the length of Oklahoma's constitution reflected both a deep mistrust of concentrated powers, but it also included several aspects, several plebiscitary mechanisms that reflected the drafters' faith in its citizens. So the fact that they include referendums and initiative petitions reflected that the people that wrote the Constitution believed in democracy, believed in small d democracy, and wanted the people of Oklahoma to have a say in the government. And of course, that is something that has oftentimes been frustrating for state government in the current environment. The whole marijuana referendum, the medical marijuana referendum of a couple of years ago, the prison reform referendums, the expansion for Medicaid for a couple of years ago. These were things that Republicans at the state level opposed, but that nevertheless got on the ballot through initiative petitions and were subsequently approved by the people. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that sometimes the people in government find themselves being end run by through that initiative or referendum process. State legislatures are very important institutions of democratic governance. There's a tremendous variation among state legislative districts, and that illustrates again the geographic differences among the states. There are similarities between the state and federal legislative branches. Just about all the states except for Nebraska, and there might even be one other state, but I think right now Nebraska is the main one, that has a unicameral state legislature. Most states these days have upper and lower chambers. And at the state level, the way it works, remember, for the Senate, people used to be selected by the state legislators. That changed with the ratification of the 17th Amendment, which I'll mention more when we get to the chapter or to the presentation on Congress. But the 17th Amendment provides for the direct statewide election of senators. At the state level, state senatorial districts are simply larger territorial aspects of the state. They reflect a larger grouping of interests, and the House representative districts are smaller, okay? So state senators represent a larger proportion of the, a larger geographic and population proportion of the state's populations, and that's typically how that works. Oklahoma's legislature is, again, it's bicameral, and again, they make up the legislative branch. There are 48 senators that serve 4-year terms. Oklahoma's lower house has 101 members, and they serve 2-year terms. And again, they only meet for very brief periods of time. Governors are the most visible and powerful figure in the states. They're the state's chief executive officers. Most state governors are elected to 4-year terms. Some governorships are 2 years, and for Oklahoma, I believe it was 2 years for many years. Governorships are often viewed as important platforms for presidential aspirants. There have been a number of, when you look at it, Tim Walz is a governor from Minnesota. Donald Trump's first vice president, Mike Pence, had served in the House of Representatives, but also was the governor of Indiana. So a large number of both presidential candidates and vice presidential candidates have been governors. And what's the advantage of a governor over a senator? Well, one thing is they have executive experience, right? Governors have authority in 4 broad areas of state government. They manage the state's executive bureaucracy where they can. They help formulate the state's policies through what we call a state of the state address. They also make proposals and ask members of the state legislature to introduce them. They act as a liaison between federal, state, and local governments. So whenever there's a disaster in a state, the governor typically will travel to that disaster area and try to make sure that that area is getting the resources that they need. And then they also, again, manage natural disasters and human-caused crises in their state. In terms, again, of eligibility and term of office, to be the governor of Oklahoma, for example, a person has to be a U.S. citizen, at least 31 years of age, and has to be a qualified voter. In other words, you can't have established, can't have voted in one state and then suddenly move back and say, now I'm going to run for office here. You have to establish, you have to register to vote in a given area within the state and establish yourself as a voter. Again, Oklahoma governors were originally limited to 1 4-year term, but a 2010 initiative expanded eligibility to 2 terms. While the governor is both head of state and head of government, he or she is only one actor in a large, complex political system designed, again, to prevent the concentration of powers. For example, Kevin Stitt has wanted to, basically concentrate more power in the governor's office. He has asked for more executive branch positions to be appointed positions rather than elected. And he has often clashed with some of his appointed people. For example, right now, he has had several clashes with Oklahoma's Attorney General, Gentner Drummond, over a variety of issues. including the charter school situation where Stitt basically supported the establishment of a Catholic virtual school as a charter school. That's a big change where a private religious entity is taking public money. That was subsequently struck down by the state Supreme Court. And Gentner-Drummond opposed that as well. And subsequently, when the state, there was a board that was not actually, removing that charter as a preferred charter, Drummond actually wrote them, a letter basically saying, you need to do this. Okay. Only 5 of Oklahoma's 28 governors have been Republicans. However, since 1995, only one Democrat, who was Brad Henry, has been elected to statewide office. Henry was governor from 2003 to 2006. The past 18 years of Republican governors, again, show the extent of dominance in electoral politics. And in fact, since 2018 or so, Republicans have enjoyed a supermajority in the Oklahoma State Legislature in the House and the Senate, or near supermajority status. And again, the advantage of supermajority status is you're basically making it to the point where the minority party, in this case the Democrats, have virtually no say in legislation because you can always get the number of votes you need from within your party. There are several state executive branch officials that are oftentimes independent from governors. Many states separately elect executive branch officials. Some states are more unitary, where they elect only the governor, and then the governor has the power to appoint executive branch agency heads, sometimes with the approval of the state Senate. States influenced by the progressive era typically allow more independently elected executive branch officials. Oklahoma has 11 independently elected executive branch officials. That means, again, that we are more on the independent scale, Stitt and some other people would say the fragmented scale. Oklahoma independently elects its lieutenant governor, its attorney general, the superintendent of public instruction, the state insurance commissioner, as well as the 3-member corporation commission, and additionally the state auditor and labor commissioner. So again, that's a lot of people who are subject to independent election. Just about all those folks these days are Republicans. State judiciaries enforce state civil and criminal laws. Each state has its own distinct, hierarchically organized court system. Most criminal cases are handled in state courts. And again, we'll learn more about that when we get to the presentation on the judiciary, on the federal judiciary. The state's court systems deal with 3 major areas: civil actions, criminal, and then administrative situations. States employ 5 basic methods for judicial selection. Those include partisan elections, nonpartisan elections, legislative appointment, gubernatorial appointment, and then the merit plan. Oklahoma actually employs what is known as the Missouri Plan, and I'll talk more about that in the next section. The removal of judges. Some states allow for citizen recall of judges, and 45 states actually have impeachment procedures. There are difficulties that are inherent in removing judges. Judicial discipline and removal commissions will oftentimes investigate and evaluate evidence related to allegations of judicial misconduct. Generally speaking, as a judge, once you become a judge, it is very difficult to remove them unless the person unless there is clear evidence that the judge is engaging in criminal behavior. And what would be the predominant criminal behavior? It would be accepting bribes, where you are basically taking bribes to either lessen a criminal liability or shield a person from criminal prosecution. Those would be the main things that would draw a problem. There are instances where judges exhibit such arbitrary and capricious behavior that draws the attention of a judicial discipline and removal commission. Occasionally what you'll have is that people who should have retired continue on the bench and then began exhibiting behaviors indicating a level of incompetence, such as falling asleep on the bench, that lead people to apply pressure to get that person to retire. So 37 states have imposed, again, a mandatory retirement age following, again, well-publicized issues with judicial senility. Most states have established judicial discipline and removal commissions. 45 states, again, have impeachment procedures. State prosecutors represent the state in criminal and civil proceedings. In most states, you have a district attorney that are elected officials that serve as independent prosecutors, and there will typically be a district attorney's office that will have other prosecutors that work beneath the district attorney. For example, Kamala Harris began her career in the San Francisco area as one of the district, the associate district attorneys for a person that was elected to serve as the district attorney. She ultimately challenged that district attorney and won that election. District attorneys enjoy nearly unlimited discretion in prosecution. Now, again, there are limitations, and the limitations are typically public opinion based in nature. For example, you've had a number of instances where you've had reformers that have come into office as district attorneys that believe that the United States has engaged in over-policing of certain minority communities that amount to discrimination. They have used their discretion to basically say, we're not going to prosecute, for example, marijuana-related crimes. The result is oftentimes they are subject to accusations that they are soft on crime. An example is down in South Florida, there was a district attorney, again, an elected official, who basically said he would not prosecute anyone under Florida's state prohibition of abortion laws. And he was subsequently removed by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Now again, this is an elected position. There's a very good likelihood that he will run for that position and win again, largely because the position he took is a popular one in that district of Florida. And so, again, when I mean they have nearly unlimited discretion, when a person is arrested, police then have to go to the prosecutors and say, here is the evidence we have, and we are holding this person, and we have accused him of this crime. At that point, the prosecutor has to make a determination. Is there sufficient evidence to warrant, prosecuting this person, or should we decline? And declination, decisions are oftentimes very pragmatic. Occasionally, you'll find a police investigation has a number of instances where they have broken rules governing evidence, which basically mean that evidence might not be able to be introduced at trial. That could influence a prosecutor to say, I'm going to have to kick this person. I'm going to have to decline to prosecute this person because police have done a poor job of assembling the case. And so there is a somewhat adversarial relationship that exists between prosecutors' offices and police. Police have to do their due diligence when they are threatening to incarcerate a person for criminal activity. Oftentimes, one of the problems, again, if you look at Oklahoma, you have two large urban areas, and then you have several several counties, that are relatively sparsely populated. Oftentimes, it is very difficult to get lawyers to move to rural areas to practice law, including acting as a prosecuting attorney. So very frequently, you'll have a district attorney that will end up representing multiple rural districts for the simple reason that there's simply not that many people, and that not many people with law degrees want to live in those areas of the country. Because again, practicing law in a very, very sparsely populated part of the country is not an avenue to making a lot of money. At the local level, city attorneys oftentimes enforce local municipal laws. And again, they're responsible for example, for enforcing ordinances regarding homelessness. This is a problem you've seen a number of times in Tulsa County and in neighboring counties where you've had a homeless population and where the city is trying to get them out of those areas because, for example, there might be a school district where there's a homeless encampment nearby and they're engaging in behaviors that the principal of that school doesn't want to see. And so you'll end up with the city attorney going in, using local law enforcement and either fencing that area off or arresting homeless people when they come into that area so that they understand that that area is no longer safe for them to congregate in. Local laws are, again, and local courts are far more important than they seem. If any of you have ever found yourself in local court, it is almost certainly because of something related to traffic that you may have engaged in some kind of infraction. Local courts are often ignored, but most day-to-day citizens' interactions within the court system are local in nature. Most local court matters are small claims in nature, meaning that the amounts of money at stake are under $500. Local courts, however, oftentimes confront serious social and political challenges. Again, the homelessness issue is oftentimes adjudicated at the local level. Likewise, when you had the pandemic and the cities would close down and basically say, we can't have businesses operating because you're likely to become a vector for disease. That affects beauty shop owners. That affects gym owners. That affects churches. And those folks, again, they feel like their livelihoods are being challenged, which is going to lead to them, creating court challenges, suing the city government. And oftentimes those cases begin in local courts and then find their way up to the state court system, or they may actually be elevated to federal courts. Okay. So a couple of questions I want to deal with. Did the Constitution's framers deliberately leave local governments out of the Constitution for a reason? The answer to that, I believe, is no. I don't think it was deliberate. I think it's interesting that again, the people who drafted the Constitution were first and foremost very experienced politically. Many of them had served in the Continental Congress. Many of them had served in their state legislatures. Lawyers were very heavily represented at the Constitutional Convention. Essentially, what I think happened is that they didn't really anticipate the federal government having much of a direct relationship with local government. And they believed that state constitutions already had provisions for establishing townships and incorporating towns, and creating municipal or combined county and city governments and the like. And so they probably believed that that was already covered. And what that actually created, that we might call it a lacuna in the federal Constitution, is it created a legal environment where states are effectively naked, constitutionally speaking. They do not enjoy any kind of constitutional protection. This gives rise to what is known as Dillon's Rule. And I believe it was James Dillon, was an Iowa State Supreme Court He was litigating a case dealing again with a railroad controversy, and it dealt with the state, with the local government. And he effectively said that the municipal governments are creatures of state government, that they breathe into the state government's life, and that they can do whatever they want as they have the power to create. They can also destroy. They can modify. They can reduce the levels of authority. And so in a lot of instances, again, because a lot of very important things happen at the local level, there have been instances where state governments have conferred upon municipal governments what is known as home rule. I'll talk more about this in my next presentation. But when you think about some of the governments, Los Angeles County, and the city of Los Angeles has something like 3 times the inhabitants of the entire state of Oklahoma. And so when you think about the city of Los Angeles, or when you think about the status of New York City within, New York State, proper, it shouldn't be that surprising that the city, oftentimes the city's interests end up predominating the state government. And so quite often when you say home rule, what you're basically saying is, because these cities are so large, they almost occupy an economic and political influence position that is equal to the state. And so they'll elect people from the city, the interests of that city will elect people that will advance and defend the interests of that local municipal government. And I would make the argument that it really makes more sense to pass legislation at the federal level, allowing those cities that are the size of New York and Chicago, Los Angeles, and I would say Houston, and say, let's give them city-state status. Let's let them be states unto themselves. They obviously have so much, power as these enormous metropolitan areas. Give them representation proportionate to the other states. Give them 2 senators. Effectively, that would improve the representation, because New York without New York City would probably be a more competitive state for Republicans. Likewise, California without Los Angeles might be a more competitive state, especially if you divided the rest of California into Northern and Southern California, because again, those areas, it's just, the state of California is such a huge state that it's almost ungovernable from a practical size perspective. And so I would make the argument, first of all, the framers didn't have a view of federalism that encompassed the idea of local governments. And that has, again, left local governments exposed to whatever it is, especially to preemption by both state and federal entities. And so I would think that if in certain instances, like, for example, again, these mega cities, it makes more sense to simply give them city-state status. There's another question. How did the United States manage the COVID pandemic compared to other countries? Unsurprisingly, I think most public health experts, especially kind of global health experts, rank the United States relatively low. In part, it flows from our political culture. Americans place an enormous priority on personal autonomy, far more so than other countries. The countries that really performed well include, like South Korea. Why did South Korea perform well? On the one hand, it's because they have had previous experience with avian flu. And so their culture was much more accepting of mask wearing than the United States. A lot of people have made the argument that mask wearing was ridiculous because no one wore the mask correctly. We didn't have the correct N95 masks for a long time. But that's really kind of secondary. The reality is that if you get populations that have trust in their government and are prepared to follow government public health directives, then you have better outcomes. In South Korea, largely, again, because the public trusted the government. The public recognized that the government was trying to keep people alive. I would also note South Korea, like a lot of other Asian cultures, have a lot of elderly people. They have a lot of smokers. They had a lot of people that within their own family structures felt like they wanted to protect. They have a much more they have a culture that places a great deal more respect on the elderly than Americans frankly do. And again, part of the problem with America's response is that at the state level, very often they adopted policies that led to rapid transmission throughout elderly retirement homes and things like that, and nursing homes, which led to massive, rates of mortality amongst, again, those very vulnerable populations. And that was something that happened in democratically controlled states like New York and in Republican controlled states like Florida. More people died in part because the COVID issue became increasingly more politicized. Because politicians made a decision to make it a political argument rather than to coalesce around a collective response. And again, part of the problem with that is it's happening in an election year. You had Donald Trump running for re-election while attempting to manage the COVID-19 crisis. And I will be critical of Donald Trump and say that I believe he mismanaged the crisis. He pushed a lot of the responsibility. He said, "Oh no, we're a federalist society. We are federalism, so the states are responsible for COVID-19." Well, if we had had a more national response, if he had provided more effective leadership, then I think we would have had less politics. And unfortunately, again, it was happening at a bad timing. Democracy can be inconvenient sometimes, and the result was. We probably had several 100,000 more people die than was, strictly speaking, going to happen. So I would argue, and you can check me on this. You can check public health publications for where the United States ranks on this. But I would say we don't rank very highly. I know because I've read most of those publications, and I can tell you. That federalism didn't necessarily help us. It acted as a way of dividing us, and that made things a lot more difficult in terms of responding to what was, again, the challenge of COVID-19. So that's all for today. When we come back, we will continue our discussion of state and local governments. I'll see you next time.